Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rich Sedano, and I'm president of the Regulatory Assistance Project. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by my RAP colleagues, Megan Anderson, Max Dupuy, and Mark LeBel. Today, we're here to discuss our new publication on gas utility reform, Under Pressure, Gas Utility Regulation for a Time of Transition. While this report is significant in its own right, we expect this to inform further work we will do on the energy transition and the public interest. Gas utility regulation has received less attention in recent decades than electricity regulation, but recent and emerging trends are going to elevate its importance. We have people joining us for this webinar who work at utility commissions that have started to think about protecting the public interest amidst the transition, and we view this as the beginning of a collaborative enterprise. Before we get started, there are a few logistical details I want to review with you. Because there are a large number of attendees, and thank you for coming, we will keep all of you muted. You could submit questions, however, in the questions box. We already have some great questions submitted in advance. We will do our best to get it to as many questions as we can. The webinar will run for 60 minutes, but we will stay on for an additional half hour if there are more questions. And finally, you should know that this webinar is being recorded. In a few days, we will send you a link to the recording and the slides. Our experts today are the three authors of the report here at RAP, Megan Anderson, an associate, Max Dupuy, a principal, and Mark LeBel, an associate. This work responds to many trends, state and local carbon targets and climate action plans, technology and new alternatives to pipeline gas, the Biden administration emphasis on climate change domestically and internationally, national climate commitments worldwide, and importantly, trends indicating changes in how people use energy. All these signal why gas regulation will soon draw more attention than ever. The report offers a framework in 3 parts for next steps for regulators: revitalizing gas utility planning, enhancing energy efficiency and electrification programs, and reforming gas rate making. Each of these 3 represented by these 3 drawings here. And in each of these areas, we focus on issues where regulators of gas utilities typically have authority, although we do flag several different kinds of broader issues. Equity needs to be integral to reforms, and the equity will make them sustainable. Equity should not be an afterthought. And here are some further thoughts about this that we hope will inspire you. Now, I will ask Megan Anderson to cover the key issues and trends facing gas utilities and their regulators, as well as gas planning. Megan?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you all for joining us today. We wrote our new paper as we saw several issues and trends changing assumptions about gas system usage and operation. Ultimately, we want to ensure that customers' end uses are being met, but as the landscape shifts, the best way to most efficiently meet those needs and protect consumers is changing. And that's especially true as we consider how to lessen the energy burdens of low and moderate income customers. I'll go through some of these issues and trends now. First, we're starting to see several factors putting downward pressure on demand. More efficient gas appliances, tighter building shells, more stringent building codes, and economic electrification of some end uses are all lowering per customer demand for gas and decreasing gas throughput. These trends are becoming more prevalent across the country, and so even in places that are not experiencing declines now, these trends are likely to surface in the future. This downward trend is likely due in part to electric end-use equipment, such as heat pumps and induction cooktops, declining in price, increasing in efficiency, and improving in quality, providing a more efficient and economical way to meet consumer end uses. Some of these appliances can also provide flexibility benefits to the electric grid, adding to their value. We are also seeing status quo gas usage becoming compatible with greenhouse gas reduction targets, including the national target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by more than half by 2030. More information about the negative environmental and health impacts from fossil gas production and delivery to gas usage in homes and businesses where it can degrade indoor air quality has also led customers to reconsider the role of gas in meeting end uses. Taken together, these trends are leading to customers both leaving the system and decreasing the amount of gas they are using when they stay. As gas companies continue investment to maintain, replace, or even add to gas infrastructure, remaining customers are likely to see substantial rate increases as those investments are divided among a smaller customer base. This slide demonstrates what that might look like for customers remaining on the gas system as compared to those who transition to all-electric homes. This potential outcome is especially problematic as many of those remaining customers may be low or moderate income customers who can face barriers to electrification. In sum, there is a need for regulators and other decision makers to get ahead of these trends to avoid the risk of negative outcomes for consumers. Our paper provides tools that regulators can use to address this changing landscape of gas regulation. So first, I'll move on to planning. Our paper outlines ways in which regulators might use the familiar tool of integrated resource planning to address the system in transition. Revitalizing gas system planning requirements can ensure that regulators and the utilities they are regulating have the information they need to address changing circumstances so that they can consider potential impacts to consumers before they occur. We have set forth a planning process that includes several steps that allow regulators, utilities, and stakeholders to consider the system as a whole to determine how the system can best meet the needs of consumers. These steps include laying a solid foundation, developing a system map for use by regulators, utilities, and stakeholders, and analyzing alternative scenarios to meet end uses, and finally, creating action and transition plans. I'll talk about each one of these steps in a little more detail. We first recommend that regulators situate the planning process on a solid foundation, which includes a robust stakeholder process, consideration of relevant policy and goals, and coordination with related planning processes. A robust stakeholder process is critical to successful planning efforts. Stakeholder processes are not just a means to provide information to the public. They are perhaps more importantly an opportunity for the utility and regulators to hear additional perspectives about factors influencing demand and supply, and alternatives to meet customer end uses. In our paper, we outlined some important ways to create a useful stakeholder process, including structure, timing, shared information, and access to utility expertise and modeling. We also recommend that planning be grounded in relevant policies and goals. Although this piece can sound simple enough, it is sometimes easy for the focus to be so much on the specific planning process that the context in which it is occurring gets lost. But relevant state greenhouse gas requirements or requirements for all electric new buildings, for example, will affect planning scenarios and should be outlined up front. Finally, where possible, gas planning should be tied into other planning processes. Consideration of electric planning processes is a first place to start. In this way, regulators and utilities can ensure that assumptions about demand for gas are in line with what electric utilities are thinking about increased electrification. And if they are not, why they are not. Other agency planning processes may also be relevant. For example, if state departments of environmental quality are enacting air quality regulations that might affect gas appliances, the planning process needs to consider compliance with those regulations. Regulators can even consider ways to combine processes for a more holistic view. As the utility is setting the foundation for the planning process, we also recommend that the utility develop a system map that will allow an overview for sharing of information, developing ideas for scenarios to meet end uses, and consideration of risk, and in particular, risk of stranded assets. In contrast to a static map of the system map we recommend should have layers of information that can be considered together. Some of these layers may be visually represented, such as the infrastructure itself, including its condition and any needs for upgrades and repairs. Other pieces of the map may include customer base, type, and demand. And the map should also include sources of supply, including risk to those sources, need for redundancies, or other potential or anticipated changes. With this information, utilities and stakeholders can then work in an iterative manner to develop and explore alternative scenarios to meet end-use needs. In our paper, we lay out some possible scenarios that might be included in such an exercise and how the layers of the system map can be used to create those scenarios. For example, in residential areas, looking at the condition of the infrastructure, on top of information about customer base and demand, might reveal areas where electrification could be prioritized. On the commercial and industrial side, scenarios might include electrification where possible, or plans to transition to green hydrogen or other fuels for hard to electrify needs. The outputs of the planning process are not new in structure. We recommend a short-term action plan that is grounded within a longer-term transition plan, so that planning is a no-regrets exercise, one that allows a consideration of scenarios now. It will allow for a transition that will meet consumer end uses in a manner that is in line with climate goals, health and safety considerations, and that protects customers. I will now hand it over to my colleague Max Dupuy to talk about energy efficiency and electrification programs.
Thanks, Megan. As many of you know, there's a long history around the country of very effective energy efficiency programs run by electric utilities and gas utilities, and sometimes by third parties. In addition, some utilities have specific programs that they call electrification programs. Now, despite these names, in principle, there isn't really a sharp dividing line between energy efficiency programs and electrification programs. As Megan said, the electrified appliances that we're focusing on today, such as heat pumps for heating electrification, are very efficient compared to gas alternatives. So a well-designed energy efficiency program can and should work for electrification. And by the same token, a good electrification program will help promote overall energy efficiency. Now, if you're trying to meet ambitious decarbonization goals in your state, then energy efficiency and electrification programs are going to be very important. But even if you're coming from a state that perhaps doesn't yet have a consensus about the idea of a gas transition, still building up these programs is something that is going to be valuable for regulators to work on right away. Why? Because these programs can help manage the trends that Megan mentioned earlier and ensure that the gas transition doesn't happen in a haphazard way that can leave low-income and disadvantaged groups exposed to high costs. And simply put, these programs can unlock a lot of benefits, including savings for customers, better grid management, and improvements to public health. Now, unfortunately, there are barriers we see in some states preventing energy efficiency programs from fully supporting building electrification. Some states have rules on the books that either flat out prohibit or discourage gas utilities from promoting electrified substitutes for gas. And this means that even where there are great opportunities to cut costs and reduce emissions by switching, say, from gas furnaces to electric heat pumps, efficiency programs run by gas utilities in these states keep promoting relatively inefficient gas options. So the clear item on the to-do list is to ease these barriers so that all energy efficiency programs can be a constructive part of the electrification push. A key part of this is moving away from having separate state goals for saving in electricity and separate goals for saving in gas, and instead to set state goals in terms of emissions overall or overall energy use. Some of these things may require legislation in some states, but in other cases, regulators may be able to clear away the barriers directly. The next thing I'd like to discuss is how to get more out of programs by having a realistic view about how customers make decisions and about the constraints that customers face in their daily lives. This is particularly important when trying to help low-income customers move toward home electrification. And home water heater replacement is a big example. A large fraction of water heaters are replaced when they fail, as shown in this survey. This is a survey from a number of years ago, but behavior hasn't changed significantly. The upshot is that customers are often making decisions under really stressful emergency conditions, which is hardly the ideal time to make rational choices about fuel sources. The solution is to have targeted early retirement programs for gas appliances that work to identify customers with likely to retire appliances. Ideally, programs also identify which of these customers live in homes that are going to need electrical upgrades and work to provide these upgrades in advance. And these programs can be particularly important for low-income customers who don't have the resources, particularly in those emergency situations, to deal with the upfront capital costs and unlock longer-term savings. And I'll also point out that designing programs that coordinate improvements to building shells alongside space heating electrification measures can be a great way to lower upfront costs of space heating electrification. Well-insulated and well-sealed buildings are easier to heat and can typically be served by smaller, less expensive heat pumps. And these smaller upfront costs can smooth the way for low-income customers to make the switch away from gas heating. The next program strategy on my list brings me to a hot topic called non-pipeline alternatives. And the idea here is that energy efficiency and electrification programs can be deployed to avoid unnecessary expansions or upgrades of gas infrastructure, such as new or bigger mains or connections to new construction. For example, an expected increase in customer demand can potentially be met through building envelope improvements and installation of electrification measures, again, unlocking substantial savings and emissions reductions. A key task for regulator in setting up non-pipeline alternatives is to create a framework that requires the utility to consider the alternative demand side options alongside traditional options using consistent criteria that capture the full range of costs and benefits associated with each choice. New York State has been doing some pioneering work in implementing this kind of structure for non-pipeline alternatives that's still a work in progress. Now, finally, in this section, I'd like to talk briefly about an idea that some might say is on the frontier of gas transition thinking, but that is going to be necessary. We'll have to start happening eventually to meet ambitious decarbonization targets. And that is the idea of geographically targeted electrification programs. The idea is to do intense, concentrated pushes for full building electrification on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, or more precisely, a gas feeder by gas feeder basis. And such an approach should allow a part of the gas distribution network to be retired, eliminating the need for continued operations and maintenance spending in that neighborhood. And this can be a help in managing the costs and rate impact of the gas transition by eliminating the need to continue spending on those cost items. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark LeBel to talk about rate making.
Thank you, Max, and thank you everyone for joining us. Utility rate making in general, and gas utility rate making in particular, covers a wide range of different substantive topics. The processes and principles are very similar across different types of utilities, although the application and details can be different. For example, the 3 phases of determining the revenue requirement, allocating costs across customer classes, and designing the final rates is the same, but the engineering and economics of the gas system are different, and that can get reflected in a number of different ways. For example, gas system peaks tend to be measured in terms of days, instead of the shorter peak periods for electric systems, which are typically a few hours. In any case, it is a complex task to try to achieve all of the different objectives on this slide all at once, one that requires significant judgments. Our first set of recommendations for rate making are the different ways to lower rate base in order to reduce the risks of major bill increases in the long term for remaining gas customers. That also has the effect of reducing potential stranded costs. The report touches on at least 4 ways to do this at varying depths: increasing customer contributions to new line extensions, accelerating depreciation timelines, better planning, and finding alternative funding sources or securitization. Planning we already talked about today, and different funding sources will be a long future debate, but let's talk about the first 2 now. All gas utilities have something called a line extension allowance, although it can be structured differently from place to place. That's the amount that a gas utility is allowed to invest in new capital to bring service to new customers. Any capital costs over the allowance must be contributed by the new customers themselves, and there are several different ways to do that. These calculations need to be updated to reflect updated projections. As new gas customers get more efficient and the probability of future conversions from gas to other resources goes up, then line extension allowances will need to go down. And conversely, new customer contributions need to go up. Next, the topic of utility capital payments and depreciation timelines gets us into even wonkier territory, although many of you on the webinar may be familiar with this. Paying back utility capital investments uses some conventions that have been around since long before I was born, but it has many convenient aspects, and there are certainly other ways of doing this if we wanted to reimagine it more broadly. But typically, there are two portions of the revenue requirement that make up the total payment for utility capital investments. Depreciation expense, which is something of a misnomer to call it an expense, and the return on investment. Depreciation expense is the formula for paying back the total original investment, which is typically done in a straight line fashion and divided evenly over the life of the asset. The return on investment is calculated based on the weighted average cost of capital and the rate base. In turn, the rate base is the original cost of the investment minus the accumulated depreciation. It is important to see the link between these items because they're related. If you depreciate assets more quickly, then the future rate base will be lower, which means a lower revenue requirement and lower customer rates and bills. Let's look at a typical capital payment structure for a long-lived utility capital asset. The blue rectangle at the bottom there is the depreciation expense spread out evenly over the 75-year life of the asset. And then that green triangle on top shows how the return on investment goes down over time as the investment depreciates. The result is that capital payments are front-loaded, although the matching principle is frequently invoked to spread the costs over the life of the asset. It's just not done evenly over time. Depreciation timelines in practice are often quite long to reflect the physical life of the asset. That's the way to make it as cheap as possible. However, if you look at a list of considerations, broader public policy and technology changes are other important considerations. So if you move from one basis, a longer physical lifetime, to a shorter timeline based on public policy and technology change, what happens to revenue requirements, bills, and rates? So this graph shows an illustrative, fairly big change from 75 years to 25 years. In the short term, in the blue line, you'll see that the revenue requirement for this asset goes up in the beginning. But then as depreciation accumulates more quickly, then the rate base also drops more quickly. In this example, after 15 years or so, the revenue requirement is actually lower with the shorter depreciation timeline. And then after 25 years, the asset is paid off, and if it's still used, then it's effectively free. This does leave out other potential changes to net salvage and removal costs. This could vary quite a bit from place to place, and I think it will require a fair bit of study. So how does this play out over time? We looked at an illustrative scenario with 4 different categories of utility capital investments prior to 2021. If you accelerate depreciation timelines today, then the remaining book value for all of those categories goes down by around 25% in 2031. And by the time you get to 2041, capital investments made before 2021 have been paid off much more quickly. The remaining book value of those assets has gone down nearly 75%, so the revenue requirement is much lower. This doesn't consider any new investments made between now and 2041, which adds another layer of complexity. New investments can and should be considered in planning and program design too, particularly ways to minimize those new investments and their ratepayer impacts. In sum though, for the most part, when you're shortening depreciation timelines, you're trading off higher rates now for lower rates in the future. This involves a number of sensitive questions about fairness over time. It is important to consider the impact of a higher revenue requirement now, even if you calibrate it to be modest, and there are ways to offset that in the short term. But the longer term question is who will be left on the gas system in 2031 and 2041. They are the ones that will be most obvious beneficiaries here, although it also reduces the need to look for other sources of outside funding or to have shareholders eat some of the costs. Cost allocation will continue to be an important topic, likely with some new nuances. Data collection and setting up the criteria for different customer classes are foundational rate-making issues that should be investigated in this context. But here are a few key recommendations. Customer-related costs should be determined using basic customer method limited to the cost of connecting a customer to the shared gas system. Minimum system approaches are an overestimate of customer-related costs. Shared capacity costs should be split up using methods that are balanced between year-round throughput and peak demand metrics. If you have the data, you can investigate using more granular time-based classification and allocation methods. And then splitting up program costs can be done fairly by using the cost follows benefits principle. Where it's feasible, that would mean sharing costs between electric ratepayers and gas ratepayers for many programs. And then we get to my favorite topic of rate design. Many of the concepts here will be familiar. Prices can and should be higher in the season that drive peak costs. Where it's feasible, rates can also send additional price signals to reduce consumption on peak days. The wrinkle here, which will also be a growing concern on the electric side, is that days that drive gas system costs are typically the coldest days of the year. People need heat to survive, so you need to be sensitive about that issue. Demand management and thermostat control programs are an alternative. But inclining block rates can also be a good choice. In California, several gas utilities have inclining block rates where the low-cost initial block is larger in the winter, which helps protect low-income heating users from major bill impacts, but still provides a higher tail block rate to the bigger consumers. Last but not least, there are several options to start to pivot the incentives of a gas utility. States should use decoupling methods that are based on overall revenue targets, not revenue per customer. Revenue per customer decoupling provides an incentive for utilities to try to keep adding customers, as well as stopping customers from switching to other fuels. And then there are different forms of performance-based regulation. Multi-year rate plans provide incentives for utilities to control costs. Consolidating or eliminating trackers has a similar impact. And then financial performance incentives can help move the utility to pursue important customer and public policy objectives. And then this can be separated out from rate making, but it's a good time to mention that broader structural considerations can also impact utility incentives. In that context, it is important to start thinking about what the future of each gas utility might be. It is a smaller footprint for green gases. Should they be allowed to rate-base clean district energy systems? Who pays for that? Should they be merged with an electric utility? Should they become a co-op or a publicly owned entity or competitive heating service provider? We are only at the very beginning of those debates. And now I'll hand it back to Rich Sedano.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Max and Megan also for covering many of the ideas that we cover in this paper. And just a few takeaways before we get into the question period. We'd like you to take away at least these ideas. First, those responsible for gas regulation can anticipate devoting more attention in the coming years, and routines may need to be examined to assess fitness for purpose. Many people will be affected by any of the changes that are on the way, and there are risks, but as is often the case in a time of transition, there is also risk in not acting. Ratepayer dollars are precious, and if there's an increasing prospect of capital assets on the utility grid side or in consumer buildings becoming obsolete before the end of their expected lifespan, this should command the attention of regulators. And alternatives to pipeline gas exist, as we've talked about alternatives in our remarks, and utility regulation can help customers to understand these alternatives, compare them fairly, and have access to them regardless of their economic status. And in the next slide, we have a few further thoughts that really are in praise of planning in a time of transition to assure that the gas system remains safe, remains affordable, and remains equitable. So thank you very much for sticking with us to the end of the presentation, and we'll now go through some questions, and we'll take those questions until the top of the hour, close to 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll close the webinar at that point. But as is often the case with our webinars, we seem to get a lot more questions, and we will stay on for an additional 30 minutes until half past the next hour, or an hour from now, if there continues to be interest. And you can submit your questions in the question pane. I see that we've already had a few come in today, as well as, but we'll start with some of the questions that came in from the registration process, and we appreciate that. And the first question is going to be to Megan, and this is from my friend Lise Trudeau in Minnesota. Are there any examples of states that require natural gas utilities to file resource plans, or are there proposals or initiatives underway to create those requirements? Megan?
Thanks, Rich. Yes, there are many states across the country that require gas companies to file IRPs or some version thereof. So that already exists in many places to varying degrees of detail. Some are quite detailed along the lines of those that we see with electric IRPs, and others are more of a shorter filing. And we're also seeing, I'm taking this question to mean sort of two parts, because there's also, in addition to the planning requirements that have existed for some time in many states, there are other states that are starting to look at new planning processes or new ways to look at what they might require of gas utilities as they see this transition coming and see that they might need more information. And so our report is really intended to speak to both of those situations, both to states that already have something in place, but they may want to think about revitalizing that or adding to that to make sure that they have the information they need to address the questions or potential scenarios that they want to look at, and also to states that don't have anything in place yet and might want to start thinking about what information they might need and how they might want to structure a planning process.
Thanks, Megan. And I'll just add that I think that gas planning has been very good at where it has been required, very good at organizing the gas utility to assemble all the resources that they have to serve the demand that they have. And I think what's changing is that with increased opportunities for customers to have alternatives, looking at this from the point of view of the customer as opposed to who has alternatives, as opposed to from the point of view of the gas company, is an important frame of reference change in gas planning. So thanks, Megan, and thanks, Lise, for the question. The next question comes from another friend, Phil Mosenthal from Optimal Energy, and this is to Max. Discuss the appropriateness of investing in any new gas system expansions, and if so, under what criteria?
Thanks, Rich. Well, one way to answer this question is to look at it through that non-pipes alternative kind of lens. And under that way of thinking, if there's a need identified at a particular location in the gas system that would traditionally be filled by gas infrastructure build out under a non-pipeline alternatives framework, the gas utility would have to consider all reasonable options on the demand side in addition to the traditional gas infrastructure expansion. So that would include alternatives, energy efficiency, electrification, demand response. So the idea is that regulators would, in requiring the utility to consider non-pipeline alternatives, would set up criteria for judging all these different alternative options. And at heart, that should be based on a cost-benefit analysis that includes all benefits and costs from an overall societal perspective. So under this kind of approach, you'd have demand-side options getting credit for benefits over the entire life of the measures in questions, including credit for avoided emissions costs, including avoided methane leaks, avoided health cost impacts. Now, to get a good idea of these costs under a non-pipeline alternative sort of framework for large-scale projects, you'd want to have a solicitation for the different options that are possible. And then maybe for smaller projects, you can use pre-identified options with pre-identified costs. And again, New York is doing a lot to investigate this approach, and has been, it's still a work in progress in New York. It's worth looking at the commission order and the staff proposal, which came out in February, for some ideas on these topics. I'll just have one more thing. Stepping back from that specific idea of specific criteria, it's worth making some big picture points. There's growing evidence across the country that all electric new construction can really make sense from the societal cost benefit point of view, but also from just consumer savings. So from that point of view, expanding the gas system is a questionable proposition for new construction. And then, of course, once you think about decarbonization goals and the possibility of creating new stranded assets, then that further argues for consideration against, or being very careful about new gas system expansions and line extensions. Back to you, Rich.
So Max, I just want to follow up. A lot of states have ways of flowing ratepayer dollars through rates to utilities for more routine maintenance of gas systems, and these are often explained as important to maintain safety as gas systems are aging. How do you think PUCs should reassess those, or should PUCs reassess those trackers for those purposes?
Well, safety is always going to be very important, but within that context, yes, it's important to look at any trackers that may have been around for a while, that may be potentially allowing for overspending on routine maintenance and that kind of spending, often with little scrutiny because no one has looked at it for a while. So re-examining that would be a worthwhile thing to do. Again, a non-pipes alternative framework can be useful for thinking about alternatives also to routine maintenance. There is the idea of requiring gas utilities to identify pipes that are aging and likely to develop leaks, and the idea would be to require the gas utility to consider non-pipes alternatives instead of extending the life of the pipe in question. And often you'd find a result that some combination of electrification and energy efficiency would be a great choice from the cost benefit perspective. So I'll turn it back to you, Rich.
All right, thanks, Max. The next question is from Charlie Herrick from the National Consumer Law Center. Thanks for being here. And to Mark LeBel, how do we ensure gas remains affordable to low-income households?
Thanks, Rich, and thanks, Charlie. So there's a lot you can do at every stage of the rate-making process. As I mentioned, the issues of determining the revenue requirement, there's basically methods where you're allocating costs over time through depreciation timelines. You also want to start to think about your overall investment strategies and your contracting strategies so that you're not locked into higher costs than necessary in the long term. At the cost allocation stage, you can think about doing a low-income rate class or a low-income heating rate class where you shield those customers from certain costs. And then at the stage of rate design, I do think it really makes sense to switch to the inclining block structure, particularly either for low-income customers generally or low-income heating customers. That's a really good way to make sure that they have an affordable bill for a basic amount of usage. Well, if they're a big user, they still have some incentive to conserve on the margin. So, those are some fairly simple, straightforward ways to maintain the affordability of gas bills. Of course, there's all sorts of other programs that Charlie is much more familiar with than I am, LIHEAP, et cetera. So you got to look at the whole picture too.
One theme that comes in many of the questions is dealing with equity issues, and I think we've always had the issue of dealing with a cost-based regulatory system and recognizing that for some customers that system doesn't work, and we need a distinct answer for them. And it sounds like that need is going to persist through this transition. We'll have a question from Max from Gudrun Thompson from the Southern Environmental Law Center. Glad she's with us. How can we eliminate state policy barriers to electrification, like prohibitions on fuel switching? And another questioner in the chat box, Kevin Kelly, I think, asks about whether there are any examples of this. This might be David Sue. Any examples of any states that have addressed prohibitions to fuel switching during this recent period?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, let me just start by giving a little context. I think something to recognize is that some of the things that we're identifying or think of now as barriers to fuel switching or barriers to electrification actually made sense in earlier times. And you can think back to earlier decades when gas, space heating, water heating was the better option compared to the electric alternative available at the time, which was typically electric resistance heating. And electric resistance heating was drawing electricity from a grid that had a lot of coal-fired power plants on it. But of course, now, as we've been telling you in the presentation, electric heating technologies improved. The heat pumps have improved in terms of price and performance. And really crucially, we've got a rapidly decarbonizing grid, a lot fewer coal-fired power plants on the grid now, and it seems to be a trend of that declining even further. So in short, programs that emphasize upgrading gas appliances to other somewhat more efficient gas appliances might have made sense in yesteryear, but now really, if we have programs that are designed to do that, we're losing opportunities to support beneficial electrification. So we got to clear away any program rules that are holding us back in that way. And we go in the paper, we go through the things to look for in terms of clearing away those fuel switching barriers. And the key is to remove any, as I mentioned, rules that create a goal in each type of fuel, a gas goal, an electricity goal, and instead move perhaps to a goal that's denominated in BTUs, overall primary energy or greenhouse gas emissions. There's a question there, a sub-question about which states have done this. We cite New York, Wisconsin, and Massachusetts that have fuel neutral targets in their energy efficiency resource standard policies. And those effectively have undone some of these key barriers. I'll mention that there's a nice report from ACEEE that came out last year that goes through every state and essentially gives the status as far as the authors understand it of what barriers exist. So I recommend that as a resource. And just a couple other things. It's useful to allow gas utilities to count the fuel switching measures that they're doing under their programs towards efficiency targets, towards their own efficiency targets. And it's also important to ensure that the value of the fuel switching measures are completely and comprehensively measured, and again, making sure that the benefits are accounted for, including the health benefits and the benefits of things like avoided methane leaks. I'd also mention reviewing prohibitions against electric utility programs that increase load. It's still important to scrutinize and be careful that electric energy efficiency measures and programs that are run by electric utilities are cost effective, but there are less blunt ways to do that, and good program evaluation procedures should be very helpful in that regard. And just a final thought, sometimes it's simply a mindset that needs to be changed on the part of program administrators and regulators, a kind of feeling of, maybe misplaced feeling of fairness that gas programs should work for the gas utility, but instead programs should strive for maximum benefits overall, and that'll mean a big emphasis on fuel switching and electrification. Thanks, Rich. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Max. Megan, we have a question from another longtime RAP friend, Rep. Franz Litz. I'd be interested if the speakers address the potential for hydrogen to be mixed with natural gas or to replace natural gas. And Megan, I know you've thought about this.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, I maybe want to take a step back with this hydrogen question and think about going back to the planning piece, which I discussed overall, about where it makes the most sense to use hydrogen or other low or zero carbon fuels. So right now, these fuels, in particular, looking at hydrogen, green hydrogen is the hydrogen that is really a zero carbon resource. And we have other types of hydrogen. They're all named by their colors. Blue hydrogen, where it's used with a methanation process that still has some carbon emissions, both with the upstream production of the gas as well as the process itself doesn't always capture all of those emissions. So when we're talking about ways to reduce the emissions, at least, we need to think about what type of hydrogen might be going into those pipes. So that's one consideration, just thinking about whether or not we have sufficient amounts of that fuel to meet all of our needs. And if we don't, which we don't now, then it's a question of where does that make the most sense to use. And there's a lot of study being done right now on the potential for existing infrastructure to be used for hydrogen. And as the questioner mentioned, there may be some places where it can be mixed, but that mixing can only occur up to a certain percentage. And there's variations and different studies about how high that is, but I think about 20% is the highest I've seen, and maybe there's people on this webinar today who've seen different numbers, but in any event, there's only so high it can go before there start to be concerns about the infrastructure itself supporting that level of hydrogen, because hydrogen is a smaller molecule. So there are also these safety considerations to think about when transitioning to hydrogen, and whether our infrastructure can sustain that, higher levels of hydrogen or replacement altogether. And that sort of goes then into this piece of, if we don't have the existing infrastructure, then it means that we might need new infrastructure to support using hydrogen as a fuel in those cases. And it might mean, if we don't have a lot of it, that we really want to think about, where is the best place to use that. It's probably not going to be a one-for-one switch with gas as we use it now. And so really going back to that planning process, and we touched on this a little bit when we provided the examples of kind of some potential scenarios that might play out. Maybe you have these hard to electrify sectors where you might want to make sure that there's infrastructure being created for hydrogen to support those uses that don't have other good alternatives. But it really gets back to this idea of planning and what's the most efficient way to meet that end use. So while there's possibility, I think it's also there's a lot of solutions out there, and really looking at which one makes the most sense for the end use in different situations.
Thanks, Megan. Yes, I think tactical deployment of hydrogen, which probably isn't going to be created at the scale that will substitute one-for-one for natural gas, and the same line of thinking goes to renewable natural gas. Tactical use where it's most useful, where it's cheapest to produce and to reduce the cost of transport, and electrification in many other places. It's a little bit more complex, perhaps, but it seems like the simple answer, as people always look for, is as usual, not so simple and not so great. Max, I have a question to you from Mike Hornsby in New Jersey. Is continuing to provide rebates for gas appliances a good idea? I think he's talking about energy efficiency programs.
Well, very good question. In our paper, we do urge regulators to consider at least prohibiting any new deployment of fossil gas equipment that would be, incentivized by rebates or other incentives under energy efficiency programs. So we caution against that. We do allow that this decision will depend on the characteristics of the state or the jurisdiction and factors, including the evolving costs of the alternatives and other local conditions. But it's, you know, with those caveats in mind, it's worth coming back to the big picture. That the case for focusing efficiency programs on electrification is pretty strong. You know, it comes back to the trends we outlined in the presentation that Megan mentioned, the improving performance and price of heat pumps and other electrified end uses, the need to protect low-income communities, and of course, carbon goals. So these point to the conclusion that energy efficiency programs really should be heavily focused on electrification and should probably have few, if any, incentives to simply upgrade gas end uses. You know, you can think about consumers are spending investment funds, capital on their buildings, and regulation can affect that. And these programs or particular rebates will encourage customers to spend money on gas appliances if they're directed in that way that will last a really long time. And so given those trends, it's questionable whether you want to have that kind of investment in a gas appliance that will last a very long time, given the need to deal with the trends that we outlined in the presentation, including decarbonization goals. So I'll leave the answer there.
Thanks, Max. And we distinguish between appliances and building envelope programs. Building envelope programs seem to be valuable and a good idea, no matter what happens to the fuel that's heating a building, but that devices perhaps are going to be in the midst of this transition. Well, Mark, I have a question for you from Dylan Sullivan, our friend from NRDC, who asks about inviting you really for additional thoughts on how gas rate design should change in the transition.
Thanks, Rich. The one topic I haven't gone into so much is really how can we use price signals and other programs to control gas peaks. And I think that's going to be really an issue of increasing importance because of the combined gas electric peaks, which have driven reliability issues in many parts of the country, which was part of the issue in Texas, of course. New England has had combined gas electric issues on and off under debate for the better part of a decade now. So that it gets to the extent that we can pass through higher prices or use programs to it leaves space on the electric side to help support reliability. Now, as we improve that issue on the electric side with offshore wind coming into the picture, with other non-gas sources of supply becoming more and more affordable and more widespread, battery storage can solve part of the issue. In the medium term, hopefully some of those issues will abate a little bit. But figuring out how to provide price signals and programs to control system peaks, I think is an incredibly important short and medium term need.
Thanks, Mark. And I want to report that Keith Hay from the Colorado Energy Office, hi Keith, checked in to say that they're working on legislation that includes a direction to the PUC to remove a rule that prohibits fuel switching. So there's another example of a state addressing that issue in Colorado. Question from Megan Harwood asks about addressing the geo-targeting of gas system changes and geographic electrification that focuses on environmental justice in low-income communities first. And Max, I know you talked about this in your presentation about how that geo-targeting could work. I wonder, Megan, if you could pick up on this from the planning perspective that you come from.
Yeah, I think this question is really interesting because it reveals what we were seeing when we were thinking about how can we come up with a planning process that starts to overlay some of these pieces of information so that you can start to see these issues. So we're seeing sometimes, for example, I think Megan's question was getting at this, that you'll have communities, EJ communities, as is the question example, where they might share a gas distribution line with industry. And so it's hard to potentially electrify that neighborhood right away when you're also thinking about needing to meet the needs of that industry as well. And I don't have necessarily a great answer specifically, because I think it's going to sort of depend on the planning process and coming up with alternatives. But what I do think is important as a takeaway is just that when we start to look at these pieces of information one on top of each other, and we can start to see where these issues are rising, then we can start to use that planning process and stakeholder input to look for solutions that may not be obvious, or we may not even realize there's that problem without starting to look at that information and look at it from these different perspectives. So it's just another shout out for making sure that the planning process is robust and that there's stakeholder input that may be not only raising these issues, but also coming up with creative solutions to solve the problems as well.
And again, a risk from doing nothing is that the people who can afford to electrify and get off the system do that, and the people who can't afford it are left with the system. So there's a strong motivation, I think, for regulators, for government officials to pay attention to this. So Megan Harwood, thanks for the question. We're near the top of the hour, and I can report that we have ample questions to keep us going for another half hour. So for right now, I just want to say thank you for those of you who were only able to commit to an hour with us, and we want to remind you about some of the takeaways that we've asked you to think about. That regulators are going to spend more time on gas transition issues than they perhaps have been used to, and that routine practices that perhaps have been ministerial are going to draw more attention and perhaps draw reform. There are changes on the way. Many people will be affected, and there's certainly, as any time that regulators get involved, a risk of making mistakes, but there's certainly risks from doing nothing. We know that there are capital assets that are going to cost a lot of money if we keep going the way we're going, and perhaps some of those assets will still be necessary, but some may be replaceable by alternatives and are avoidable, and taking efforts to identify those will be beneficial to customers. And finally, this is about people, this is about customers, and regulation can help customers, can be focused on customers, can be oriented around customers in the transition to help them understand their alternatives, compare them fairly, and have access to them regardless of their economic status. So planning for the transition is a good investment for a state's economy and for all the people in it. So with that, I'll thank everyone who is going to leave, but also welcome everyone who's going to stay, because we will be taking some more questions for the next 30 minutes. And the first question I'm going to get to, maybe is you might want to stay for this one. A lot of questions came in basically around the idea that gas companies are pressured, and perhaps some of the questions posit that they have to go away. Some of the questions posit that they are going to need to change a lot. Some of the questions ask about how to engage gas companies more effectively in the transition, to make them part of the transition, to make them partners in the transition. And I'm going to ask all three of our presenters to give their thoughts about this. And I want to start with Mark, because some of the more fundamental things have to do with the financial aspects. And one questioner also asked about bond rating agencies, and perhaps Mark, you can build into your response to this about the future of gas companies and their engagement with this transition, and perhaps also reflecting on the people who rate their debt. So, and Megan and Max, you're welcome to add after Mark is finished.
Right. So I think with appropriate action and signals from regulators, that there's no reason to downgrade these entities. That if regulators, both through decoupling, accelerated depreciation, these are methods that help utilities pay off their debts faster and ensure that they can make all these payments on time. So there are lots of things that regulators can do to ensure a financially solvent utility that should frankly be reassuring to the bond community. That said, certain things about this will certainly change. If there's a downward trend in the amount of capital investment over the next 10 years, then the need for utilities to go out and make major new bond issuances may go down. And to a certain extent, similar things on the equity side. So, there's going to be an evolution here about what the capital investment needs are for the utilities, what new money they need to take in. Can they do more through self-funding? But I think the regulators can really do a number of things on rate making that send the right signals that we will maintain a financially solvent entity, and we will make sure that the particularly bond payments will be made in full and on time.
Megan, do you have anything to add about the way the gas utilities engage with this transition?
It's a tough question, as you intimated, and we've certainly had a lot of discussions about it in writing this report. And I think that's one thing just to get out there on the table, that as in any transition, there are challenges and there are opportunities, and it's probably going to depend quite a bit on the circumstances in different places and different companies. Certainly, some of these gas companies are dual fuel utilities, and that might be a different situation for them. Other gas companies may see opportunities to transition to different types of energy service companies, or pursue other business models that might still meet customer end uses in ways that still maintains the strength of that company in that changed formation, however that may look. And so this evolution of businesses isn't something new. This happens all the time, and I think it's going to be a discussion that we're having throughout this transition as to what are those opportunities and what are those challenges and what does that look like for different companies in different places. And all of this discussion of sort of where we are now and anticipating this is going to inform those discussions quite a bit.
Thanks, Megan. Max, anything to add?
I'll just bring it back to a overarching point, which is that most decarbonization scenarios, looking at what the world would look like in, say, or what the US in particular would look like in 2050, for example, envisage that there is a need for some kind of gas fuel supply, likely some type of green molecule that will be supplied for the hard to electrify segments, in particular, certain segments of industry and so on. And so it's a matter of focusing perhaps on solutions for those customers. It's just that it looks like the economics and the need is to switch away for for buildings from the fossil gas supply that we have now, and likely renewable gas would not be suitable, as Megan has discussed already. So there are changes coming, and that's the main theme of our presentation, and there'll be much more work to be done on these subjects. Thanks.
Gas utilities are public service companies, and one of the things that RAP has spent time on lately is performance regulation, and it has certainly come up in our conversations with a few states about whether some sort of carbon standard should be in the product that the gas company sells. So there's a lot of new ideas, new thinking. I think in our work, we've scratched the surface and asked a lot of questions, and like many of you are still in the process of searching for answers that we like on this. But I think we recognize the importance that gas companies have in many of the places that they are, and it would be desirable to find ways to make use of their qualities while dealing with the imperative of climate change. Okay, well, Mike Florio asked a question about line extensions, and I won't repeat the question because it's a little harsh, but I think that there is a lot of favoritism in the way states handle line extensions, and I'm going to take this myself, and if Max or Mark want to add something to this, they can. But I think that as a former state official myself, as Mike has been, we have seen government equate economic development with natural gas deployment and expansion. And that has been done without a climate change lens. And now, of course, that there is a climate change lens that's increasingly being applied by states, by communities. We'll see what the federal government does. But I think there is a link between economic development and natural gas that needs to be reconsidered. And one of the outcomes of that link is the line extension policies that we see around the country. So our report does talk about how line extension policies can be changed, and I think Mark discussed some of those details. But underneath that is a presumption that gas is part of the economic vitality of a place. And to the extent that that runs into conflict with climate goals, climate targets, climate compliance, to the extent that that becomes important, then we're going to have to, I think, reassess that. Do any of my colleagues have anything to add to that? Okay. Chris Beck from Maryland asks about the voluntary replacement of gas assets. I think he's talking about a voluntary replacement in the system. And I think this gets to what is the implementation of the planning process and the geographic targeting that Megan and that Max talked about. So Megan, maybe you can say a little bit more about the voluntary replacement of gas assets, and perhaps that goes on the gas side and perhaps also on the customer side of the meter.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the second part first about the customer side. I think that we're certainly seeing in some places, if this is, I hope where the question's going, that there are customers who are deciding to switch out appliances for electric alternatives, whether for economic reasons or for in some cases, we're seeing concerns about health or just concern about other factors that may lead them to that conclusion. And at some point, that leads to if it's done in a whole home basis, can lead to customers getting rid of their gas lines, and that so there's that distribution side where that can be driven by the customer for economic reasons or other reasons they may have, but it's not necessarily tied to policies other than there might be for incentivizing purchase of those appliances in certain places or something like that. On the other side of that, the connection to the gas line of utilities voluntarily replacing infrastructure, I think this is where we're really, from the planning perspective, looking at, are there possibilities for the utility to say, here's an area, for example, where we're seeing a need for replacement of pipes because they're old and they're just due for that replacement. And maybe there are utilities that look at that and say, actually, in the grand scheme of things, this is an area where we already have decreased throughput, or we're anticipating that because of new regulations, that sort of thing. And this is probably a little down the line from where we are in most places now, but I think a trend that could be surfacing more and more. And so there might be just a cost benefit analysis of this is an area that it makes more sense to think about, including in the planning process, what would it look like potentially to decrease service in that area. And as Max outlined in one of the slides we had up, moving away from gas service to a certain feeder, and doing that in advance, because of course you can't leave those customers without the infrastructure they need to stay warm and to cook and all of those good things. And so making sure that we also, on the flip side of the coin, have the electric infrastructure in place to meet what will likely be greater demands for electricity. So those are some ideas in response to that question. I hope I got at the spirit of it. Maybe others have other thoughts.
Thanks, Megan. Any of the Max, Mark, anything you want to add?
I'll just reiterate that it is really important to have the utility, the gas utility, as a part of a fundamental part of the way it thinks about doing planning, as Megan suggested, and a fundamental part of the way it thinks about investing in meeting needs. You want to have built in there a framework that looks at the different possible alternatives, the traditional alternatives of system expansion, gas system expansion, and the demand side alternatives as well. And if you can bake that in and implement the framework, so essentially the gas utility is doing that in a self-driven, somewhat voluntary fashion, that is, I think, where a well-developed sort of non-pipes alternative framework would be hoping to go.
Great. Mark, anything you want to add? Okay. Well, we have had a couple of questions. David Morton, John Howard, maybe a couple of other people have asked questions that get to, in most parts of the US, and there is a gas company and a separate electric company. And I think some of the things that we've talked about suggest the value, perhaps the need for coordination between the gas company and the electric company supervised by the regulator. And I think there's an appetite to hear us talk a little bit more about how we envision that kind of coordination, whether it's in planning or in efficiency programs, electrification programs, whatever kind of coordination, how that might work, and realizing that we're in a blue sky place, and so this is going to be a bit new. I'm going to ask Megan to start with this one, and then ask the others to jump in if they want. I do want to hear what, Mark, you have to say as an experienced person in PUCs. But Megan, why don't you start with how we might envision the companies coordinating?
Yeah, we intimated, or we touched briefly on this, I should say, in our report on, looking at possibilities for joint planning. And I think the idea really comes from this, how do we best meet the end uses of customers? And so coming at it from that frame, instead of being in a electric IRP box or a gas IRP box. And so how do we start to look at some combining of these processes to instead ask the question, what is the most efficient way to meet this end use, and then how can we do so? And so, there's some baby steps, I think, that can be taken at the onset for example, as we mentioned, having some coordination between those two planning processes to at least have some sharing of data. So if the electric company is predicting an increase of demand because they're seeing a lot of electrification or anticipating that, to make sure that that's also being coordinated with the gas company's IRP, so that one's not saying we're going to see demand on this side because of electrification, and the other one's saying nope, no electrification, and we're going to see demand on the gas side too. And so there's opportunities just in this sort of practical data sharing way to start to have some of these planning processes at the very beginning start to get combined. But then I think there's also we're seeing some more creative places where they're saying, and this is definitely at the kind of cutting edge of this, of looking at this question of end uses and saying, what's the most efficient way to meet these needs? And maybe there's allowance for saying, you need to show us to both companies that you've looked at this and that this is on both sides and that this is the best way to meet this end use, and giving a little bit more transparency as to that planning process. And I also just looking at the stakeholder process and making sure that we're asking these questions of stakeholders in these processes. So we've seen this a little bit, I think, on the electric IRP side, or in procurement proceedings on the electricity side, where we're seeing stakeholders come in with alternative ways to meet in needs that may not have been on the table by any of the companies in that proceeding, but coming up with solutions that include demand response or energy efficiency or combinations of resources that might actually be able to meet those end uses in a different way than that's being put on the table by those companies that are kind of still in their framework of thinking about what they have to offer. So I think just another a great opportunity to use those stakeholder processes, in particular when there's data sharing and access to some of the modeling that these utilities are using for some of these other ideas to get put on the table and get put in front of regulators for consideration.
Thanks, Megan. I guess the other option is that state agencies can rightfully serve some of these coordination roles across utilities and even do independent forecasting. So one sort of related example of this is in Connecticut. There is still something called an integrated resource plan for electricity, but it has very little to do with what an integrated resource plan is for a vertically integrated electric utility in say the middle of the country. It's a state planning and policy document where they look at all of the trends that are coming up, the key policy issues, and comes up with some recommendations and does independent analysis. So if you there could be an increasingly important role for, it could go to a public utility commission, but it might be more likely to go to a state energy office to take some of this coordination and independent forecasting role on themselves.
Yeah, there are several states with comprehensive energy planning requirements. I know that New Jersey has such a thing. Vermont, certainly, many other states do, but those tend to be more longer term and not applying directly to utilities. And I think one of the challenges is bringing the detailed of integrated resource planning, and as some of the states here know, some of that has become more specifically into distribution planning, and extending that perhaps over to gas will require a level of coordination that we've typically not seen. And I think we had some questions about whether there are specific examples of planning processes that are specifically built to accommodate gas and electric utilities. And Mark, as far as I know, we're not there at that granular level. Is that right? Is that your understanding?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So that's work to come. Mark, did you want to say something else?
Well, I mean, so one or two examples, the Massachusetts 2050 decarbonization roadmap gets fairly detailed on what the sort of least cost pathways are. So that's sort of headed in the direction of more detailed integrated work across, heating, transportation, electricity, to sort of pull all those strands together. But it is still fairly long range. It's focused around 2050.
So Mark, I have a question that's a bit hard-nosed for you, and that's, can we use securitization to make any of this transition financially goes more smoothly?
So it certainly should be an option on the table. I have not heard of this being used on the gas side yet. Obviously, it's an up and coming topic in the electric sector transition. I think that there's going to be a stage here where there's a lot of different options on the table, and we do a call out box where there's 6 or 7 different ways to alternative funding sources, and securitization is put in that box. There's the securitization, lowers repayment costs at the cost of locking in ratepayers to a more serious commitment that a utility can't shake off in bankruptcy. So there are trade-offs there. It's not a free option. There is a question if, to the extent eventually gas utilities do go away in some real manner, what happens? Who pays back those costs? Does it eventually go back to the government in some way? And those are important things to sort of figure out in terms of the details of the financing arrangements. But you can use general funds, you can use carbon pricing, you can use any number of other funding sources to offset costs here and effectively reduce ratepayer burdens. So you do want to sort of look at it holistically to see what your options are, and talk about it with all the policymakers, legislature in your state to see what best meets your overall needs.
Thanks. Now, this is a bit of a challenging question for all of us. There is a question about political backlash to a transition that would reduce gas. There's certainly a lot of people who like using gas. There's the people who like cooking with gas, and many other reasons for allegiance to gas as part of a lifestyle. And of course, the gas industry itself is going to want to be very concerned about how this all plays out. Do any of you want to talk about the politics of this? I know maybe that's a little bit beyond your pay grade, and maybe I'll do that if you don't want to, but I'll invite you if you have any thoughts about the social side of this transition and how that might translate into politics.
I can weigh in with just one thought. I think that, and then I'll quickly turn it over to you, Rich, but I do think that there's certainly political challenges, but we're also seeing the challenges of greenhouse gas targets that states are setting, and just the fundamental question of how to meet those. And so, there's going to be pushback, of course, and there's political questions, but there are also those questions about how do we meet some of the goals that states and national targets that are being set. And so it's not a black and white situation. There's these needs on both sides.
Right. Yeah, I think government is about dealing with dilemmas. Max?
Well, I've just mentioned one topic, which is a hot topic, which is the question of municipal governments essentially restricting any new construction from having gas connections, and that's been in the news quite a bit, and I think we can expect that to be a continued controversial subject. So one way to approach that question would be, there are different ways of managing the gas transition, whether you're in a state where that setting very ambitious codes for building is not possible. It's still an alternative approach is to have more of a carrot-based mechanism that has perhaps efficiency programs that seek to go beyond whatever the code is in your state or the state in question. And so the efficiency program can be set up to provide incentives to promote electrification measures that are not required in codes and can reference the code as a base point.
The only other thing I'd add is that, on the rate making side, there are a lot of things you can do short of forbidding people from connecting to the system. But you do want to take a hard look at the numbers to make sure that any new customers are not gonna be a burden in the long term in terms of the cost that they've imposed. So, you don't want people to be, some jurisdictions do technically require customers to sign a contract that they will use a certain amount of gas for a certain number of years. That's probably counterproductive here if we do want to encourage choice. But there are, these contributions at the time of connection are a way to say, look, you have the choice, but you're going to have to pay for it, and we're going to make sure that you're not don't end up imposing costs on others. So that's sort of a short-term way to maintain choice while reflecting a hard-nosed attitude towards costs that could be imposed on other people.
Well, thanks, Mark, Megan, and Max. I'll just say that I think that a fight in the legislature about municipal moratoriums is probably an indication that some sort of more constructive process is in order for a state, and perhaps the powers that be in a state can guide toward that direction in the manner that we've talked about. Well, I think we're at a point now where another question will bring us over our time, so I'm going to bring this to an end, even though I apologize to those questioners who we didn't get to, but I do want to just say one last thing, which is that all of us feel that there are some important opportunities in the gas transition, also some challenges, some very serious challenges. And I think our approach is let's confront them, let's ask the questions, let's confront them directly and avoid the idea that we can shy away or kick the can down the road or hope the next person can deal with it. So I hope that in all the different jobs that you all have, that you will all take that to heart and will, in the ways that you can, and we will in the ways that we can, try to encourage constructive conversation about a gas transition that is consistent with being fair to the utilities, fair to future generations, and fair to low and moderate income people as well as all citizens. So with that, I want to thank all of you for coming, my colleagues for preparing all this great work, and I hope that it's useful for you and everyone else out there in utility regulation. So with that, have a good day and stay safe. Bye-bye.